Okay, here's one more argument for the existence of God, the cosmological argument. This one's a bit similar to the design argument, but also different. So, according to this argument, and again, we'll get into the details in a minute, everything that begins to exist has a cause. And this excludes things that are existing infinitely. Perhaps you might think about numbers or something like that. The universe began to exist. This is assuming that the universe is finite. Therefore, something caused the universe to exist. That cause must be God. This seems very incomplete, but we'll get into the details of it in a minute. So causation is a strange concept, and it's actually generated a lot more controversy than you might think, just as a layperson or normal person's point of view. David Hume argued that rather than thinking of the universe having just one cause, we could think of a cause for each part of the universe. So a kangaroo is caused by another kangaroo, and the egg is caused by the chicken, and it all goes back forever. Hume says no further explanation is necessary. There's no need, according to Hume, for something like a first cause of anything. Causation could go on forever. And for each thing, if the causation goes on forever, then each part of the whole has been explained, so the whole has been explained, and there's no further explanation necessary. So you might ask, where does the cake come from? Well, the cake comes from flour and sugar and eggs and milk. Well, where do each one of those things come from? If we can explain where each of those things come from, then he says you might say we don't need to explain where the whole comes from. We don't need to sort of think that the cake should have its own explanation aside from the explanation of each of the ingredients. And that might not be the best example, but you sort of get the idea there. So, if you have a group of things, then you can just argue that each of the group has an explanation, and that's enough, according to Hume. So, but Alexander Pruss argues that Hume's explanation is incomplete, and he gives the example of a cannonball being fired. So, on Hume's view, Pruss says you can explain each position or state of the cannonball by referencing an earlier state of the cannonball with a relevant natural law, so say a law of physics. So, the cannonball is at state 2, which is somewhere in the air, and then why is it there? Well, because it was at state 1, and then the laws of physics applied to such that it went into state 2. And the problem that he says that Hume has here is that we would never really get to the cannon itself as firing and beginning the chain of events. If we're just explaining each state of the cannonball, then we're not going to have sort of a first cause. How did the cannonball get into the air in the first place? This could be debated, but this is Pruss's argument. So why think that there is a beginning? And again, the cannonball example may make it seem sort of obvious, but again, you can go back to Hume and say, well, okay, if somebody asks you what the cause for this event is, and then you ask for a cause of that event, and you ask for a cause of that event, it might just go on forever. Or there might be simply randomness, or there might be any cause at all. And you really have to provide a reason why that's not a valid answer. And philosophers realize this, so Leibniz is attributed with this principle of sufficient reason, but it obviously goes back much before him. But anyway, this is the idea that for any fact, there must be a reason why the fact is the case. So if the universe began as a fact, then we must be able to point to reasons why the universe began as true. And again, this seems really obvious, but it ends up having a lot of problems. But suppose we apply this to sufficient reason to the cosmological argument, then we can revise it as such. So by the principle of sufficient reason, every event has a cause. The universe beginning to exist occurred as an event. Therefore, the universe beginning to exist must have a cause by the principle of sufficient reason. The cause must be God. Now you can see already, because we already talked about this with the design argument, how the move from 3 to 4 is going to be a big problem for this argument, right? Because there's not anything in the argument that's going to tell us why God has to be the cause. So you're going to need a separate argument for that, which is going to turn out to be a problem. We'll see that in a minute. So if God exists is also a fact, then the PSR would seem to demand a reason for God's existence as well. So maybe we're not solving the problem here, we just have a different infinite regress of causes. So you could appeal to the ontological argument that we just discussed perhaps here and say that, okay, God doesn't need a cause, perhaps because God has already existed, or God causes God's own existence because of God's nature. You could go back to those properties that God has and say, by these properties, God doesn't need a cause. So either existence is somehow contained in the definition of God, which is kind of what the ontological argument said, right? Or God is the ultimate cause, causes God's own existence. But then why the heck do we need the cosmological argument to begin with? So it seems kind of circular, doesn't it? So again, this seems circular if we take the cosmological argument to be arguing for God's existence based on the existence of the universe. And the first possibility seems to make the cosmological argument unnecessary. If God causes God's own existence, why are we arguing for God's existence based on the existence of the universe? Why bother? We don't need the cosmological argument then. So it seems like we're kind of going in circles here. And to talk about the move from 3 to 4, why would we think the cause is God? If we accept the universe must have a cause, why would we assume that cause must be God? And again, you could appeal to something like the nature of God, or that the universe is so big and so great that it needs something very powerful to create it. But again, it's the same problem as the design argument. Even if we could say that you need a really powerful something to create the universe, it's not necessarily going to be the kind of monotheistic God that we outlined at the beginning of this chapter. Again, it wouldn't have to be a benevolent God. It maybe have to be an omnipotent God, but maybe just a really powerful God. It wouldn't necessarily have to be omniscient. So there's a lot of things that would get left out here that you would have to make a separate argument for if you're going to say that the universe must have a cause based on the principle of sufficient reason.